Okay, we are back live for part 2 of this walkthrough on the housing material that is in S100. And with us is David Hall. And I think, David, unless you convince me differently, what I'd like to just do is what's in the bill and then what are all these deleted sections? Because we had I don't know if you have that material with you right off the bat. I think we have the bill we have access to the bill as it passed committee as opposed to what passed the Senate, so we could get a good idea. But I think in the end, we're going to need to know what those sections were because they kind of coincide with some of the work that we did earlier this year. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay, I couldn't tell from the grimaces on your face.
Well, I just because I don't have an easy way to with just this iPad to get.
Maybe you can you borrow that?
Do you want me to start with the bill as it passed, and then we'll
Yes.
try to switch gears?
Robin's going to give you the summary that somebody has kept going.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I have one too.
Deleted sections and they're.
Right. I can access that from my email.
This was,
Yep. Oh, it's no problem. I can.
Oh, yeah, do you want me to email you that? David, I could email you that, I have it.
So I guess the question is, do we need to look at this together as we're going through it? Because if I
want to start just with what's in the bill right now. It's passed the Senate.
that, because I can get that electronically. We'll start with what's survived. So David Hall Legislative Council, I worked on what really was the second half of this bill, almost all of which was stripped out in the Senate Appropriations Committee because it involved basically about $90 million worth of spending.
Some of that spending which we passed in our budget, or we passed elements of. I mean, that's what I want to look at, and we'll have more work on that done over the next couple of days, just about what exactly was stripped and not so much the why, but.
Sure. Well, I mean, the why is easy. It is Senate appropriations practice to remove all appropriations from all Senate bills in anticipation of balancing their budgetary needs in the context of the Senate proposal on the budget. Typically, they will remove appropriations sections and they will also remove programmatic sections that relate to that spending unless they can stand on their own. I think there's a fair question here on VHIP. They chose to keep the language that passed out of Senate Economic Development on the VHIP program. I will editorialize and say I thought that was curious, considering that the language changes are quite expansive. They broaden the program significantly. So without additional spending, it effectively is going to dilute what spending is available on an expanded program. I think there's also a question. I'd be genuinely curious to hear at some point, how the executive branch approaches this question, namely, when programmatic changes are paired with new spending. It would be my interpretation that the new spending would apply with new program parameters, but previously appropriated funds would not be subject to the new program requirements. I mean, we do things in our laws always by default prospectively, and typically, you appropriate funds that go with a program. Each fiscal year is new, so when changes happen on July the 1st, typically there's new money. If substantive changes have occurred, it all works together nicely. But, that isn't, let's just say hypothetically, this change happens to the program, but no new money is authorized to go along with it. Would the agency interpret that to mean that money they have on hand from previous fiscal years could be used in a new way? Or is that sort of locked in under the old regimen and then the new changes would not apply unless there was new money? I would interpret it the latter, but they may not. I don't know.
Well, I think we've had a conversation in the same vein a couple of years ago with this same material. So that's a good question for us, because again, we took testimony this morning I'm looking at the end of line 19 and line 20, which says including weatherization, but it's not limited to, it gets into the conversation that we had about the rental registry, where including weatherization could also include accessibility. It could also include any roofing, anything that the department decides. So the weatherization is used here as an example and not as a set limitation on what this program can be used for. So again, and as David mentioned, this language here, does it scroll over to the next slide, or is this?
Oh yeah, there's gonna be a lot of changes in this section.
Okay, so again, this section 3 years ago when we first implemented the VHIP program, it was meant to bring on apartments or units, housing units that were not in code back online by providing a certain amount of money that would be matched presumably for renovations. Then that housing would first be available to people who were experiencing homelessness, coming out of homelessness. If a tenant could not be found under that category, then it would be somebody who was at a certain percentage of the every median income. And if a tenant couldn't be found with that parameter, then it could go onto the market. But this is different. That's just teeing it up for David to show us.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the history of this because as it evolves, keeping in mind where it fits in the portfolio of housing programs, I think is relevant. One last thing I want to say to my previous point about the dollars is that, it may be worth considering. I assume you're going to appropriate new money for this program and that they're, planning on using up what they have, but it may be worthwhile to specify at some point in a bill to say whether or not you intend any money they might have available from prior years, whether it should be or could be used under an amended program.
And so are people getting what David's saying here? Because if the program had three pieces, if it had ABC, what he's saying is that last year we appropriated money so that program would do A, B, and C. But if we approve a program that has A, B, C, and D, E, and F in it, what he's fearing is that money that may not have been spent yet, that was supposed to go to ABC, the department may decide or may want to decide that they could use that for DEF too, even though that money was only, because this has all been one-time money, right? This has all been spent out of ARPA money, or this year we asked in our budget memo for them to appropriate a certain amount of money for the VHIP program. So, if we didn't change this, then perhaps you could say it's going to the existing program. But if we're creating a new program or improving the program or whatever, I think that's what David, I think, is getting at here, is that when we add new things to an existing program, should that one-time appropriation be used moving forward without review? And again, this is something that came up a couple of years ago in a much smaller scale, but there was a disagreement between us and the administration about how that money would be spent, given what happened with the policy. So, yeah.
I was under the impression, and for full disclosure, my background prior to this is on the healthcare committee. So I was under the impression from that committee that any unused funds had to, but those are one-time funds, that they had to be returned to the general fund. Is that not true?
Not always. I mean, there can be a.
Specifically stated?
You'd have to go to the budget language. There is some language in there about sweeping the money if it's not spent during the fiscal year, but that doesn't happen with everything. And part of the purpose of budget adjustment is to reallocate funds that have been unspent before the fiscal year expires. So, I mean, I'd say as a general rule, my understanding is that's not a universal practice.
And we can ask the commissioner's scheduled to come in and
Yeah.
we'll ask him directly as well. So let's let David go.
So I appreciate your indulgence on those points. To the program itself, this is, remember, now codified in Title 10, Section 699. And it's run through DHCD, but really the statewide regional non-profit housing partners are the ones administering the program. And the first change here on page 41 is it's shown as new, and it is new to the extent that it applies to all units created through this program right now. There's already language in the ADU section of this program that says you can't use an ADU as a short-term rental. This would apply that prohibition universally to any kind of unit, not just an ADU. We're going to get further down that rabbit hole in a moment. I will say, there's no limitation on this language, right? So, does that mean forever? Who's going to keep up with it? Does it only intended for, during your participation in the program or some period of years beyond that? It may be worthwhile considering, the literal scope of this language.
So again, grant, it could be a grant, it could be a loan, depending on how the landlord uses the unit. And so there is an end. This is limited affordability. Like this is when we invest large amounts of money, we expect perpetual affordability, that for always a unit will be considered affordable, and it will be affordable for a certain person who has a certain financial demographic, like AMI. What David's again saying is that this doesn't cap it. This is saying that forever. Whereas I think the intent was after 5 years, if you're working on a loan, or 10 years if you're working on a grant program, and the parameters are set in statute. After that, then it goes to market. It's a market priced apartment. And so that's because, again, for $30,000 to $50,000, the argument that we settled, the compromise that we settled on when using state or federal funds for housing, is that at that level, perpetual affordability perhaps is unfair, and it wouldn't get used. The money wouldn't get used for that. So I think that's what David's saying here, is that that this caps the ability to use it as a short-term rental, period.
Yes. And
That's a policy choice.
indeed. So under B, the eligible rental housing units. So this is really the thrust of the expansion. I think it's fair to characterize it as such. You'll see right now in current law, you can basically renovate a non-code compliant unit, so a unit that does not comply with the requirements of applicable building, housing, or health laws, or two, a new accessory dwelling unit. And remember, I know you've talked about this a lot this year, ADU is a particular kind of unit. It's, there's parameters in statute in Title 24, but has to be, not bigger than, 30% or a certain square footage. It has to be pertinent to, somebody's primary residence. So it's a discrete kind of accessory unit in ADU. Okay. So the changes here, you'll see in 1A, the unit is an existing unit, whether or not occupied. And, my understanding from the literature and testimony is that the administration of this program has been to require a unit to be unoccupied. And that is not part of the law. It was removed from some of the original versions of this, in fact. So it's curious to me to have heard that that's how it's being implemented. But this clarifies, for purposes of the statute, that it can be occupied or unoccupied. And under B, if it's occupied, the grant or the forgivable loan shall include terms and conditions to avoid displacement of the current residents. I have to read that to mean, permanent displacement, not necessarily temporary if it's necessary, but I don't know. So that may be, something for you to consider, whether you want to put some more clarity there. So 2, you'll see the change is to provide the opportunity for the creation of new units. And specifically, right now, you can, as I said, you can create a new ADU, but the additional language would also allow for the creation of a newly created unit within an existing structure. A newly created residential structure that is a single unit, or a newly created unit within a newly created structure that contains 5 or fewer residential units. So obviously, that is another step down the path away from renovating non-complying units. Now we're going to go to the creation of up to 5 new units in a brand new building.
So I'm sorry, so A.
Yeah.
All right, that's existing. B, I have an 1864 house. It's a single family home. It used to be an apartment. If I wanted to change it back to an apartment, I'd need to put new locks on. I'd need to fix the plumbing so that there was a kitchen. So that's B.
Yep.
Right, so that's creating a newly created unit within an existing structure.
Yep.
As opposed to ADUs, ADUs has always been the mother-in-law apartment. And then it used to have to be appurtenant to the building, and now we've allowed it to be a freestanding unit on an owner-occupied property. But B and C, or C and D now, are completely different, and they kind of get into the area of the missing middle rental or the just a whole new unit. It's like subsidizing a whole new unit, saying this is paying for my bathroom. Or anyway, that's how I'm reading those. Those are more directly related to other programs that exist as well, or may exist someday.
David, do you know if in the creating a newly created unit within an existing structure, with the 1865 farmhouse, long-term part of it, does that have to meet current energy code standards? I think, that's
It's not energy code, it's health and safety code.
building standards. Well, building, housing, or health laws.
I have to tell you, I don't know the scope of the RBES at this point. That's an Ellen question. I'm sorry.
Okay. And then the other thing about whether it's occupied or not is the whole idea of displacement is something that I'm familiar with in terms of nonprofit housing agencies who go in and renovate, and they move people to different apartments, whether they move permanently or not. But they do move them before they renovate the apartments, and then they have an option of coming back. This is in that category, but it's not that clear. All right, cool.
Any other questions on 2? Okay. C, administration stays the same. sort of a uniform process, standard application, grant management system, et cetera. So under D, program requirements, so these are sort of the universal requirements. These are for both grants and for the forgivable loans. The max is 50,000 per unit. You had authorized in determining the amount that they could consider the number of bedrooms. And my understanding is, I think it's universal that it's $30,000 maximum for 2 or fewer bedrooms, 50,000 for 3 bedrooms or more. So that's not part of the law, but that's part of the administration, is my understanding. There is a matching fund or in-kind service requirement of at least 20% of the value. May include weatherization, shall comply with building, housing, and health laws. Under 5, it passes through with succession for the period of the grant of the loan. And those are public records. So none of that is changed in D. Just wanted to flag the 30-50 that's happening right now. And I guess, we didn't really talk about the caps in the Senate. There wasn't much discussion on whether those are they're still the right numbers after a few years or not, but that's where we are. So the next 2 subsections apply to grants and then to loans. And there's a reason for the differential treatment. There's a 5-year grant period, right? Or a 10-year forgivable loan period. And that's because the 5-year grant has a few more strings attached to it, right? So for a grant awarded through the program, the following requirements apply for 5 years. So as the chair was referencing, first, a landlord shall coordinate with nonprofit housing partners and local coordinated entry organizations to identify potential tenants. Except as provided in T, the landlord shall lease the unit to a household exiting homelessness or actively working with an immigrant or refugee resettlement program. If under B, you determine one of those households is not available, then priority goes first to a household with an income equal to or less than 80% of AMI. And if they're not available, to another household with the approval of the department or the housing organization. Under 3A, a landlord has to accept any housing vouchers that are available for rent and utilities. And under B, if no voucher or subsidy is available, total cost for rent, including utilities not covered by rent, shall not exceed fair market rent under HUD standards. 4 does offer the opportunity to convert a grant to a forgivable loan. And that in lines 14, 15, and 16, if you do that, you shall receive a 10% credit for loan forgiveness for each year in which the landlord participates in the program. So I want you to keep in mind that basically the function here of E and F is that the requirements would apply to any kind of unit that's created. It depends on whether you do it with a grant or with a loan. And those are the conditions that apply to the landlord. It's determined by the mechanism. So for a loan, a landlord has to accept, it's a 10-year period. Landlord has to accept housing vouchers if available. If no voucher, fair market rent. 10% of the amount of forgivable loan for each year the landlord participates. And so that over a 10-year period, that gets you 100% forgiveness. In G, we are striking out the ADU specific provision here. And what that will mean functionally is that ADUs will be subject to the same requirements depending on whether somebody uses a grant or a loan. So we're not going to give an ADU differential treatment from any other kind of unit. Whether that's good or bad, there's plenty of policy debate on that. But if you did a grant for an ADU, then yes, your first priority would be owed to families exiting homelessness or working with Immigrant and Refugee Resettlement Program.
And that's, again, if you're taking the money for, even for new construction, that's the carrot and the stick.
Right. So, the lean priority piece is unchanged, and that is it. The Senate Policy Committee had appropriated 20 million additional dollars for VHIP, and again, it was removed in Senate.
We may have done the same, but double check.
So the other substantive piece that survived, section 43, is a housing permitting and approval process performance audit, but it's not a directive to do a performance audit. Is a directive to the auditor to prepare a plan, cost estimate, and timetable to conduct a performance audit of the residential housing development and approval process.
So like an RFI.
Sort of. So the purpose of that performance audit, and you see it starting in 13, would be to identify measures, including potential legislative and policy changes that will improve the timeliness, economy, and efficiency of Vermont's residential housing development approval process. Auditor's plan may allow for some or all of the audit to be conducted through a contract with a third party. So again, it is a directive to the auditor to come back with a plan, cost estimate, and timetable for conducting a performance audit of the housing development and approval process. And that's what made it across the Senate finish line for me.
Representative Krasno?
Did I miss, where's the part about the study committee? Wasn't there something that passed that there was gonna be a study on something, right? Yeah. Where's that at? Said,
Well, here's the thing.
Oh.
What passed the Senate is different than what passed the committee.
right,
So when we heard testimony, and you may not have heard it, or you may have watched it or whatever with Senator Clarkson yesterday.
oh, I did watch it, yes.
So I was looking at a section by section breakdown based on what David just presented. And Senator Clarkson and Harrison were talking about the money for the landlord fund that would cover rental arrears. They were talking about a lot of the monies, and that's not in the bill right now. So those were deleted, and again, they're deleted for protocol or whatever processes. We'll find out. What we have to do is connect this policy with some of the money that we put in the budget already, that, you know, we talked about in our budget letter, and that some of it passed, some of it didn't. So when they say 90 million, there's $90 million, well, maybe that included, we put in about $90 million of stuff anyway in the big budget. And so we'll double check and make sure that
Got it.
that the money that they're talking about, so we'll go back and review what was passed by the
Okay.
committee, so we'll have an understanding of what was deleted.
Got it. Thank you.
Pretty much everything.
Yeah, I'm like, what's going on? Okay. That's what I'm so, yeah, all right,
But
thank
again,
you.
that's just part of our process here, and we'll, David has zipped over to that, the bill is passed committee, is that what we're looking for
Okay.
now?
Yep, which is also the bill as introduced because it was a committee bill. So
Right,
Right.
so 30 through 39 were deleted.
Oh, wow.
So do you want to take a quick walk through these or?
Sure, we have a little bit of time for that, we'll
Okay.
work until 4:00, so.
Okay. So, section 30 was an appropriation of $2.5 million to AHS to provide eviction rescue funding on behalf of tenants for rental arrears and prevent eviction for non-payment of rent if the funding would preserve tenancy.
And so that was, we've talked about this as, actually as eviction diversion, part of the eviction diversion conversation.
31 was $200,000 to DHCD to expand home sharing opportunities throughout the state. 32 was $500,000 to DHCD to provide financial support for home repair, home improvement, housing transition, park infrastructure, legal assistance, and technical assistance, and also a study concerning how to incorporate the needs, considerations of mobile homes and parks, including infrastructure habitability, into all existing state housing programs, and 2 opportunities and barriers to creating new mobile home parks and to maximizing the efficient use of existing parks.
So we can look at how that matches up with what we've passed already.
VHFA, section 33, the first generation home buyer program, and slight changes to expand the definition of a first generation home buyer. A few more people could participate. So it's a person it's either home buyer, and whose parents or legal guardians do not have, and during the home buyer's lifetime have not had any residential ownership interests in any state, or lost ownership of a home due to foreclosure, short sale, or deed in lieu of foreclosure, have not owned a home since that loss. And then there's an additional $1 million to VHFA for grants through that program.
We'll hear from Maura Collins with the HFA on some of these programs.
So 35, it's repealing the session law missing middle pilot program, sort of rebranding it and codifying it, Title 10, Section 629, the Middle Income Home Ownership Development Program. So functionally, this is, even though this looks like all new language, there are some tweaks, but for the purposes of 13 minutes, it's basically the missing middle program, which helps subsidize the cost to developers for building affordable home ownership homes, right? And that's in distinction to a new program that is created here, the Rental Housing Revolving Loan Program, which is to help subsidize the creation of affordable rental housing units. So Section 37 for the middle income ownership, that's $20 million appropriation. And then for 38, the Rental Housing Revolving Loan Program, also through VHFA, also to help subsidize the cost of, again, affordable rental units for the period these loans are live and being subsidized. There is also $20 million for that.
So we heard a little bit about that from Maura Collins earlier this year. So the for the middle income building program, basically what it did, if a builder came in and applied for this funding through VHFA, and so much of the nonprofit housing world has been focusing on rental units and multi-unit buildings for the last 20 years easily. And there is existing a shared equity program, which is what this is. This is not quite the full shared equity program where housing may be built on land that's owned, and it's owned by. There's a whole, again, it's very complex, but basically, when you see a home in the paper being advertised by VHFA or by Champlain Housing Trust or someplace like that, and they're saying, well, if you have the right income, it could cost $135,000. You're paying a discount price based on what the market is, and it's a shared equity program. So if you are making less money and this is what you can afford, you're buying into it, but it's been subsidized by previous subsidies or by previous owners. So now you own the building, you live in it for as long as, let's just say 10 years, it appreciates in value. But when you go to sell it, quite a bit of the equity that's been built up is returned back into the house in order to keep it affordable for the next person. That's the way it generally works for nonprofit housing agencies. What this is saying is there is that income-based potential subsidy involved, but as David just landed on the developer subsidy. So basically, if a developer comes into VHFA and says, look, I can build this house Eganville is 2,500 to 2,000 square foot house, but it's gonna cost X amount of dollars, and the town says it's only gonna be appraised for X minus $50,000. Cause labor costs have gone up, material costs have gone up, but I can't build this house for what it's appraised at. So I can't build a market price house without help. They'll come and apply for the funds, and the developer would receive the balance of the costs to build the building. And there's also an affordability subsidy that could be given to the home buyer. And then there's rules affected by that. So this was a program that we approved last year. This is the one that I believe that they said was oversubscribed by $9 million in the Budget Adjustment Act. And we funded that $9 million to fulfill those applications for the Missing Middle program, as it was called. Now there's this new program, and we did talk to VHFA earlier this year, and at least our budget approved the $20 million. I'm not sure where it went in the budget. But some of those houses have to be, David, number 3 at the bottom of the page. So those 30, no less than 33% of the funds would include a housing subsidy covenant consistent with an existing housing covenant, subsidy covenant. So we tried to protect as much of the money as possible that would go into conventional shared equity. But this was also to allow private developers who don't have access to some of the same funds, the ability to build if they can't make the numbers match. And again, the policy decisions of what we want to do with it is up to us to go through, and it sounds like it's the exact same program, it's just been renamed. And we'll get testimony on that over the next few days, so. And the rental program that David just mentioned is new, and we some preview language on that back in January or early February.
So I will note that there's a change here, and it's repeated in the other program, a little bit on the administration side, just basically saying how directing the HFA to design and implement the program to ensure maybe more outreach and better geographic distribution for the subsidies, including to rural, more underserved areas of the state. Some of the stuff that was found in the rural caucus or early iterations of some of their proposals to.
H111.
Yes. So we got 7 minutes. Want to make sure we just touch on.
And then
We already did VHIP.
yeah, and then just a quick thing on the loan fund. Again, there was money. It sounds so complicated at times, but there was money appropriated to DHCD, I believe, 2 years ago. It was $1 million for a program like this that didn't get put into place. So the department had $1 million just sitting in their account. And in our conversations last year over, I believe this appeared in S226, we were able to secure that $1 million and appropriate it to the HFA. And the original intent was after taking testimony from the BIPOC community in particular, but not just BIPOC, there was, in Vermont, it was also, it was everyone who didn't have an opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. We had a draft program in an earlier piece of legislation along these same lines that didn't pass. And so we were able to secure that $1 million and send it to the HFA for this program, which then, as they developed it, they reached out to all the stakeholders, and there was a certain amount of constitutionality that had been discussed about. It's really, we can't just say this money is for this particular class of people, no matter if they're protected or not, because that's unconstitutional. And And so they worked to try to change their program rules to be more inclusive, but to not ignore the underserved regions or people who have been experiencing the lack of opportunity. So, and again, BHFA will come in and testify about how those changes were made and the potential for the program moving forward.
David, can you go to section 42? Which was also removed. The note here says appropriates 25 million general fund to VHCB to create new housing across a variety of types and sectors. And I'm just curious what the language says.
That's the whole thing in that paragraph.
I think we use that, we can do more research on it. I think that we appropriated $25 million to VHCB, at least the BAA did. Not sure if it had the same language, so we can check that. All right, any further questions for David at this time? David, usually I don't know if you can answer this, and we have a request out to the auditor's office. The auditor usually determines what their own audits are going to be. I've never experienced, at least in our committee, where we've said to the auditor, we want the Department of Liquor to be audited, or we want anything to be audited. So this is new. I mean, this is new to me anyway, is mandating that the auditor at least prepare a proposal for them. So we will hear from him. David, I cannot help but ask.
I didn't want to.
How you gonna do basketball on Friday?
I was gonna say that.
Oh,
Paper cut?
I wish.
Ooh.
Slicing a tomato and took part of my thumb with it.
Oh.
I already played basketball.
Was it a dull knife to the tomato?
Ooh.
Not a dull
Sharp to your
knife.
thumb?
Not a dull knife, which maybe made it better.
No.
I was able to put my right back on there.
All right, well done.
I think I may have mentioned my wife is a nurse practitioner, so.
Oh,
She's a what?
A nurse practitioner.
Now we all know. We'll care for it.
David, how is her sewing skills?
Fortunately, I did not have to find
Oh,
out
that's good.
this time.
Did she glue it?
No, we just did the steri strips and bandages. It's been a week, so. I mean, I can't dribble left-handed anyway.
All right, thank you, David.
Yep.
Thank
See you
you.
soon. Take care.
All right, committee, let us, before we go off live, we'll just, so tomorrow, we will start the day with Ellen Tchaikovsky. We will get a walkthrough from Damien on S103, which is discrimination. It's two elements of discrimination law. Again, I know this is like a broken record. It's material that we've passed through this committee. And it's passed through the Senate, just never in the same year. And so, not that I expect us to not work on it, but it's been discussed for many years, and it's there is some controversy about them, but they're just they're employment-based discrimination laws. So we'll get that walkthrough tomorrow. And then after the floor, Maura Collins will be here. According to the schedule, Doug Hoffer, who is a state auditor, will be here. And Mike DeRocher, who's the director of the Division of Fire Safety, will be here. So we'll hear these witnesses on the sections that affect them, which we heard about today. And we'll continue having conversations about what other housing pieces we want to put. We won't have our whiteboard drawing today, but and then, no, thanks. And then, I'm sorry, on Friday, we're going to cancel our little field trip once again because we've been asked to get S100 out as soon as possible because of the fact that it has to go to at least 3 other committees. So we will have Habitat for Humanity from 9 to 9:30 on Friday morning to do an update on the work that they're doing. And one of the reasons why Moore Collins wanted to come in was to talk about how perhaps there's a nexus between some of the stuff that's in S100 with Habitat for Humanity. So we'll get an understanding of how Habitat does their work. And then we'll hear from Josh Hanford, Commissioner Hanford, Sean Gilpin, and then Boryang will be back in again to discuss elements in one of the deleted sections here of the bill, which has been mentioned, which is the $100,000 for a litigator for the Human Rights Commission to litigate with a focus on fair housing law. We will work through lunch time on Friday so that we can adjourn at 1:00. It's Good Friday. I'd like people to be, especially people who observe, to be able to have the opportunity to get home and observe. So,
And thank you for getting us out now for the first night of Passover as well.
and you're welcome. It's part of knowing that we all come from different places.
Yes, we do.
If you're interested in pondering lead paint, when you go up to the, I'm serious, when you go up to the 3rd floor and you're at the elevator, you don't use the stairs, you can look out over the peeling windows of the State House. Think about, I'm serious.
I'm interested. I never looked.
They're all totally peeling and to mitigate that. But the peeling bits could fly off or will fly off into the soil.
It could be that all the lead paint is already peeled and this is the new latex that's peeled since 1978.
Could be.
Should we
But
ask
that's why it's a point of contemplation and not
Right, that's not.
No, the person, I mean, you could ask Alice, but the other person to ask would actually be, it'd start with the curator. And then
Okay,
possibly just go to BGS, which would be through Alice's committee, but just somebody would be able to say, oh, yeah, we stripped that in 1978 and we haven't painted it since. But I don't.
I'm just saying, just think, it's a point to ponder as you're waiting for the elevator, as I did.
And we
For the
did
elevator to
have,
come
we
up.
did have someone from VHCD scheduled to testify to us that we bumped for S100 but they work under a different program. They work under a federal lead removal program. So it's not quite the same, but we will continue to reach out where we can and when we can to the Department of Health and find out what parameters under which we can find. I mean, again, the dilemma in front of us is that people are being asked to take a certification course, pay, the price list was, it could be $3,000 a year to maintain a license, but they cannot get insurance for the work that they're doing because they're not professional painters.
Right.
So there is something in there. I did talk to somebody who's related to the health department. It wasn't Mr. Englander, and it's unofficial stuff, but that they kind of went, no, that's not what we're trying to. We're not trying, the goal once upon a time when all this passed was not to have this be the outcome. And that doesn't mean anything we've heard already isn't valid. It's just, I'd like to find a way to not have every landowner who has a 1978 property or 1978 property with a new addition on it to have to pay $3,000 a year for something they can't get insurance for. I just think that there's something, it just strikes me as one of those things that there's something wobbly in there and I'd like to figure it out. So.
yeah, one of my constituents, I think he emailed everyone, is gonna look for a quote to see what it would look like.
I haven't heard anybody say this should be passed, so, I mean, that we should keep this misunderstanding somewhere in. All right, thank you,
Okay,
let's
thank
go
you.
off live.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about after offline, before, or like,